Hello, my name is Thamara Faustine and I'm going to present you a brief explanation about the 20th century which occurred in 1945 to 2000. So let's get started. The first, what happened? So the Second World War was happened in this century. So it didn't bring any stability to many world, okay? And then the atomic age with the dropping of bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945, and then happened the Cold War between the Communist bloc and the West in the late 1980s, which the Iron Curtain divided the world politically into communist and non-communist. And then because of the United States America entered the First and Second World War and being on the winning side each time, it helped them become the dominant economic and cultural forces in the world. And the position was strengthened by the fall of communist regimes. Then the years since the end of the Second World War have seen a decline in British influence and continuing failure to compete successfully with the newly developing economies of the world. In the national terms, the country has also seen decentralization. The regions have competed with London for economic, social, and cultural influences. Next is also the change in the society after the Second World War. For example, is the first the sense of fragmentation developed into the sense of absurdity, of existential futility, where there was a veritable explosion of expression around the question of the atomic bomb, around the possibility that our life could at any moment. And then each decade in the second half of the 20th century had a distinct and different feeling. For example, just like in the 1950s was the age of austerity, and then the 1960s the age of youth, the 1970s was the age of anxiety, the 1980s was the age of new materialism, 1990s as an age of recession and preoccupation. So where modern was a keyword for the first part of the 20th century, the term postmodern has been widely used to describe the attitude and creative production which followed by the Second World War. Next, about the literature in the 20th century. So the literature was based on the unscientific, irrational thought process, and it rejected logical thinking. And then the subject is still human condition, but there are no more heroes. There is the individual solitary responsible for his or her own destiny, yet powerless when set against the ineluctable forces of the universe. Then the identity is a common theme. For example, the sexual identity, local identity, national identity, racial identity, and many more. And the Second World War was much more dominated by the broadcast media, for example, the cinema and then the radio. And also there is the Irish writers were especially important in this century, including the James Joyce and then the Samuel Beckett, and for the Americans like T.S. Eliot, Ezra Pound, and the British modernists, for example, just like Joseph Conrad, Virginia Woolf, and many more. You can see it in the slide. And in the mid 20th century, major writers started to appear in the various countries of the British Commonwealth, including the several Nobel laureates. And then the drama since 1945, so the theater was dominated until the 1950s by well-made plays in standard English for middle-class audience. However, the language of the drama in the 20th century underwent significant changes. For example, from Oscar Wilde in the 1890s to Noel Coward from 1920s to 1940s, it was consistently elevated and stylish. The formal elaborate speech mode matching the high social status of many of the characters. Then Shaw Lawrence Cine and O'Casey, I'm sorry for the pronunciation, and both it in dialect and lower class accent, and helped the transition to more working class voice in the theater, which emerged in the post Second World War drama. Then the plays of Beckett, Osborne, Pinter, or Orton in the 1950 and 1960 are more colloquial and slangy. It keeping with the setting and the characters. So their language is more naturalistic and show gaps, repetition, silence, and incoherence modeled on the normal conversation. Next is the poetry of the Second World War. So the writing of the immediate post-war era reverberates with the sense of nostalgia of ending and later with the sense of emptiness. Many of the poems were written in the protest against the established social order and particularly the threat of nuclear war. For example, is the Auden's long poem of 1948. The Age of Anxiety is often seen as giving a label to the Second World War of the 20th century. And then the Eliot's Fourth Quartet was the major political achievement of the war years. So it was written at the distance from the action of war, with the anxieties of the pre-war years already well documented. The role of poets on active service in the Second World War was different, like the poets of the First World War. They were participants and observers, rather than critics and commentators. Then Alan Lewis, with there's a sense of pessimism in his work, which can be felt in his best-known poems. For example, All Day It Has Rained, Riders Down, and many stories from him. Next is about the poetry since 1945. So the years after 1945 saw both continuities and changes in English poetry. Some poets, despite modernism, continue romantic tradition with writing deeply personal responses to the world and engaging with the eternal elemental themes. And there was also so many artist writers. Then the central viewpoint in their poems is an I, a single voice, recording experience directly and shaping them in general traditional poetic forms. Other poets are not as clearly in the romantic tradition. The I in their poems is more indirect, and experience is presented more ironically. The focus is restricted, concentrating more on the particulars of everyday life. However, no poet fits neatly into the categories of romantic or anti-romantic. Some resist this useful but simplified categorization. Then the novel since 1945. So the decades following the Second World War increased the number of novels published in the variety of themes and subject they cover. Yet at the same time, there's also critique the death of the novel, which began in 1920s, as some writers such as T.S. Eliot, James Joyce, and Virginia Woolf consciously distanced themselves from the popular taste. And then, among the voices which can be more clearly heard in the novel in the recent years are those of the young and the lower classes, the voice of the new educated middle classes, the voice of women, racial minorities, gays, and outsiders of many other types. Various subgenres of novel have become bestseller while retaining intellectual acceptability. For example, the working class novel and many more. And at the same time, there have been numerous bestsellers which have never reached intellectual acceptability. For example, the romance thrillers and the historical novels. Some genre like the detective story and the spy story have, however, begun to receive critical acclaim and to be recognized as the major contribution to literature. The novel, for example, is the George Orwell, the 1984, an Animal Farm which consists of many satires and it's so really good novel. Next is the other literary characteristic. So the first is the writing for young readers, so-called the children literature. So the Victorian writers first wrote for younger readers, and these tales were often highly moral, instructional books, school stories, and adventure tales. And in the early 20th century, a vein of whimsy became popular with such writers such as the A.M. Milne, achieved, achieving classic status with the Winnie the Pooh. And then we have Roald Dahl, who brought children's writing into the late 20th century with a punch. For example, his work is The Tweets, which about an ugly and unpleasant husband and wife. And at the end of 20th century, we have J.K. Rowling, become the worldwide best-selling phenomenon with her series of books featuring the schoolboy wizard Harry Potter. And then there is the dialogue novel. So one feature of the modern novel which takes on a great importance is the use of dialogues and conversation, especially when presented with very little narrational intervention. This gives the readers the challenge to filling out the script. And then the middle century novel, there's also in this characteristic. And then novel sequence. So several writers in English have followed the French writer Marcel Proust in writing multi-novel sequence. And then the campus novels. The role of women as inferiors and or outsiders in society has concerned many writers, and it's concerned with Muriel Sparks' works. It depicted in their works and his and her works. I'm sorry. And then internationalism. So internationalism emerged in writing at the end of the 19th century when outsiders like Shaw and Conrad began to make their mark on English literature. And then we have written Englishes. So in the 1950s, Sam Salvan was the first writer of the West Indian origin to write novels and stories about immigrants to England. As such, his voice is a very important one and has all too often been ignored. But his social observation, his humor, and his linguistic inventiveness deserve to be widely recognized. He practically invented the literary use of a new variety of English, just like the London Caribbean English, in such novels as The Lonely Londoners. And then this kind of new local English can come from anywhere in the world, and indeed writers in the British Isles from Scotland and Ireland and English dialect writers have exploited into non-standard forms in literature for centuries. And then there is also new modes of modern writing, for example, just like rewriting and reinterpreting the past have been a major concern of recent novelists. And then there are many examples of the modern guy novel and homosexual themes in mainstream novels, as well as in genre like thrillers and historical novels. And then there's also the contemporary Scottish novel. So some writers of the contemporary Scottish novel are Alasdair Gray and James Kelman, who have contributed greatly to the revival of Scottish literature in the vernacular accent of Glasgow. And then the contemporary English novel, for example, is Angela Carter. Many modern or postmodern writers, he had a great fondness for the intertextuality that passage and a wide range of allusion permits. She brings together magic realism, postmodernism, feminism, the Gothic, the real, and the surreal. So her novels illustrate her range and daring, just like in the Bloody Chamber and then the Nights in the Circus. It's illustrated through the characters change sex, grow wings, move between reality and fantasy, and explore beyond the range of normal human experience. And Her short stories were collected posthumously in Burning Your Boats, which published in 1995. Like many other her contemporaries, Angela Carter looked back to the tradition which informed all storytelling and rewrote the history of our own times in her own style. Okay, this is my references. Thank you for your attention. And I'm sorry if I did many mistakes during the presentation, and have a good day.